A teenage trip meant to last a few days ended without warning. One moment there were crowded sidewalks, beach traffic, and late-night movement through a tourist strip. The next, a young girl was no longer answering her phone. What made the situation confusing was how ordinary everything looked at first. There was no disturbance reported, no obvious sign of danger, and no clear moment when things went wrong. Friends believed she had gone to meet someone nearby. Family believed she was safe with people she knew. By the time concern settled in, the setting had already shifted from a place of fun to a place of unanswered questions. The disappearance did not happen in isolation. It unfolded in public, among thousands of strangers during one of the busiest weeks of the year. That contrast between visibility and disappearance would define everything that followed. Before we continue, if you want to follow carefully reported investigations like this one, you can subscribe here. In April 2009, Brittanee Drexel was a 17-year-old from Rochester, New York. She traveled to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina during spring break, joining friends who were already there. The trip was not formally planned with her parents. She had told her mother she was spending the weekend at a friend's house, not traveling out of state. This detail would become important later, but at the time it meant there was no immediate alarm raised when contact slowed. Brittanee stayed at the Bar Harbor Hotel along Ocean Boulevard, a busy area known for heavy foot traffic, nightlife, and constant movement during spring break. The environment was crowded and loud, with people coming and going at all hours. This made it difficult to distinguish routine activity from anything unusual. On the evening of April 25th, Brittanee was seen at the hotel. At some point, she left the room wearing a white tank top, denim shorts, and flip-flops. She did not take her purse. She carried her phone. Those details were later confirmed through witness accounts and early investigation. Friends believed she had gone to meet someone nearby and expected her to return. She did not come back. As the night passed, attempts to reach her failed. Calls went unanswered, messages did not receive replies. Initially, there was uncertainty rather than panic. Spring break settings often involve unpredictable movement and late hours. The assumption was that Brittanee was with other people and would reconnect soon. When morning came without contact, concern deepened. Friends began retracing steps along Ocean Boulevard and nearby areas. They asked around the hotel. They checked common gathering spots. No one had seen her return. No one could confirm where she went after leaving. Law and her appearance. They began building an early timeline based on what could be verified. The setting posed immediate challenges. Myrtle Beach during spring break is crowded with visitors from across the country. Many people stay only a few days. Surveillance coverage varies, witnesses come and go. What might have been noticeable on a quiet night could disappear within a sea of activity. Investigators focused first on the area around the hotel. They reviewed available surveillance. They interviewed those who had been with Brittanee earlier in the evening. They worked to determine whether she left alone or with someone else. Answers were incomplete. Accounts differed. No single version of events could be confirmed. Phone records showed activity on Brittanee's device after she left the hotel, but the information did not immediately reveal where she was or who she was with. The phone would later become central to the investigation, but at this stage it only confirmed that she had not vanished instantly. It did not explain what happened next. As the news of the disappearance spread, Brittanee's family learned the truth about the trip. What began as confusion turned into urgency. They traveled to South Carolina and worked closely with investigators. Public appeals were issued. Photos were shared. Tips began to arrive. The early days were marked by motion without clarity. Searches were organized. Beaches, roads, and nearby locations were checked. Flyers appeared across the area. Each effort reflected the belief that someone had seen something, even if they did not yet realize its importance. What made the disappearance especially troubling was the lack of a clear moment of danger. There was no reported argument, no struggle, and no confirmed witness who saw Brittanee in distress. The case did not begin with violence, it began with silence. By the end of the first phase, one fact stood alone. A 17-year-old girl had walked out into one of the most crowded places in the region and did not return. Everything else remained uncertain. The trip that was supposed to last a weekend had ended on a sidewalk under hotel lights, leaving behind only questions that would take years to answer. The hours after Brittanee Drexel was reported missing were shaped by urgency and uncertainty. Law enforcement approached the situation as an active disappearance in a crowded tourist area, where time mattered and information moved quickly. The first priority was to confirm what could be established with certainty and separate it from assumption. That distinction became difficult almost immediately. Investigators began by speaking with the friends Brittanee had traveled with and those who were with her earlier that night. Accounts were gathered about when she was last seen, what she was wearing, and where she said she was going. These details formed the earliest outline of the timeline, but they did not align perfectly. Some recollections differed on timing, others differed on destination. None could confirm who she met after leaving the hotel. The environment complicated everything. Ocean Boulevard during spring break is crowded late into the night, filled with visitors who do not know one another and who often leave town within days. Witnesses may see moments without understanding their significance. By the time investigators arrived, many people who had been nearby were already gone. Police reviewed available surveillance footage from the area around the Bar Harbor Hotel and nearby businesses. Coverage was uneven. Some cameras captured parts of sidewalks and entrances. Others offered only limited angles. No footage clearly showed Brittanee entering a vehicle or leaving the area with someone. The absence of visual confirmation did not rule anything out, but it offered no direction either. At the same time, phone records became a focus. Brittanee's phone showed activity after she left the hotel, including text messages. The content and timing suggested she was communicating with people, but the information did not immediately reveal her location. Investigators worked to trace the device, but early tracking data lacked precision. It showed movement without clarity. Public appeals were issued quickly. Photos of Brittanee circulated through local media. Law enforcement asked anyone who had seen her to come forward. Tips began to arrive almost immediately. Some reported sightings along the strip. Others suggested she had been seen with unknown individuals. Each tip was logged and evaluated, but few could be verified. Conflicting narratives emerged early. Some accounts suggested Brittanee had left voluntarily to meet someone she knew. Others suggested she had been approached by strangers. None of these explanations could be confirmed with evidence. The investigation moved forward with caution, aware that early assumptions could misdirect effort. Brittanee's family arrived in Myrtle Beach and became involved in the search. They worked with investigators and participated in public outreach. Their presence added urgency and visibility to the effort. The disappearance was no longer just a local concern. It drew national attention as news outlets began reporting on the case. Search efforts expanded beyond the immediate hotel area. Law enforcement and volunteers checked nearby roads, parking areas, and less visible spaces where someone might have gone unnoticed. Beaches and surrounding neighborhoods were examined. The scale of the search reflected both urgency and uncertainty. Despite these efforts, no physical evidence was recovered. There were no personal items found that could explain where Brittanee had gone. No confirmed witness could say they saw her after a specific point. Each unanswered question added pressure, but it did not produce clarity. The early days revealed how quickly an investigation can become fragmented when accounts conflict and evidence is limited. Every new detail required verification. When verification failed, investigators had to step back rather than push forward on unsteady ground. Media coverage intensified, and with it came speculation from outside the investigation. Law enforcement worked to maintain focus on verified facts, aware that public narratives could influence witnesses and distort memory. The goal remained to build a reliable timeline, even if it meant discarding information that could not be confirmed. As days passed, the search continued, but the tone shifted. The initial belief that Brittanee might be found quickly began to fade. The investigation did not stop, it adjusted. Effort moved from rapid response to sustained inquiry, guided by what could be proven rather than what seemed possible. By the end of this period, the case stood at an uneasy point. Brittanee Drexel had vanished from a public place filled with people, yet no one could say with certainty what happened after she left the hotel. The early search had produced movement, attention, and volume, but not answers. What remained was a growing file of conflicting accounts and an investigation that would soon face the challenge of deciding which direction, if any, could still be trusted. As the search continued, attention shifted toward leads that appeared promising on the surface but proved difficult to confirm. Investigators worked to identify patterns within the information collected during the first days. Phone records, tips, and partial witness accounts formed a growing body of material. The challenge was determining which elements pointed toward real movement and which reflected confusion common in crowded environments. Early analysis focused on Brittanee Drexel's phone activity. Messages sent after she left the hotel indicated she was communicating with people, but the information did not reveal location with certainty. Cell tower data placed the phone within a broad area rather than a specific point. This lack of precision limited its usefulness during the early phase. Investigators knew the phone could offer insight, but at that stage it raised more questions than answers. Tips from the public continued to arrive. Some suggested Brittanee had been seen walking along Ocean Boulevard. Others claimed she had entered a vehicle. A few described encounters that could not be verified by time or location. Each report was logged and reviewed. Most could not be confirmed through surveillance or independent witness statements. Without verification, investigators could not treat them as established fact. One difficulty involved distinguishing meaningful sightings from ordinary spring break activity. Myrtle Beach during that period is filled with people matching similar descriptions. Young women wearing similar clothing moved through the same spaces at the same time. This made misidentification likely. Investigators had to consider that some reported sightings may have involved someone else entirely. Another focus involved individuals Brittanee may have communicated with shortly before disappearing. Investigators attempted to identify contacts connected to her phone records and messages. Some connections were known, others were unfamiliar. Establishing who she planned to meet, if anyone, proved difficult. Incomplete information limited what could be confirmed. The investigation also examined whether Brittanee's disappearance could have been accidental. Searches considered nearby construction areas, bodies of water, and places where someone might become injured without immediate notice. These possibilities were explored and gradually ruled out as evidence failed to support them. As the search expanded, investigators faced the risk of following false direction. Leads that appeared urgent sometimes collapsed under review. This required constant adjustment. Law enforcement balanced the need to act quickly with the need to avoid chasing unsupported narratives. Media attention continued to grow, bringing increased public awareness but also increased noise. Some tips were influenced by media reporting rather than first-hand observation. Investigators worked to separate original information from repetition. This process slowed progress but protected the integrity of the investigation. One of the most difficult aspects involved decisions about priority. With limited resources, investigators had to choose which leads to pursue immediately and which to hold for later review. These decisions were based on available evidence at the time, not hindsight. What later appeared significant may not have seemed so in the moment. The early period also revealed how easily an investigation can be diverted by incomplete or misleading information. Certain narratives gained attention because they seemed to explain the disappearance, not because they were supported by proof. Investigators were aware of this risk and attempted to remain focused on verifiable facts. Despite effort, the investigation did not produce a clear suspect during this stage. There was no confirmed individual linked to Brittanee's disappearance through physical evidence or reliable witness testimony. This absence did not end the investigation, but it shaped its direction. Without a suspect, the case remained broad and complex. As weeks passed, the accumulation of leads without resolution created a sense of stalled progress. Investigators continued working, but the lack of breakthroughs made it clear that the early phase had not captured the decisive moment. Whatever happened after Brittanee left the hotel had occurred without leaving obvious trace. Looking back, this period would later be understood as one where critical signals were difficult to recognize amid volume and confusion. At the time, investigators acted within the limits of information available. They documented what they could, preserved records, and prepared for the possibility that clarity might come later rather than sooner. By the end of this stage, the investigation faced a turning point. The initial surge of activity had not produced answers. The case was still active, but it was no longer driven by immediate leads. It would soon enter a longer phase defined by review, preservation, and the hope that time would reveal what early urgency could not. As the search for Brittanee Drexel continued, the investigation gradually became shaped less by evidence and more by information that appeared to explain what could not yet be proven. The absence of physical findings left room for claims that sounded detailed and specific. In an environment defined by uncertainty, detail itself began to carry weight. Information reached investigators asserting that Brittanee had been abducted and killed by individuals connected to the local area in South Carolina. The claims described actions and locations with confidence. At a time when no clear direction existed, the specificity made the account difficult to dismiss. It offered a narrative where none had been established. Law enforcement evaluated the information as procedure required. Investigators examined the people named in the statements. They checked locations that were described. They attempted to find corroboration through records, witnesses, and physical examination of sites. Resources were committed because the information could not immediately be disproven. No forensic evidence supported the claims. Searches did not uncover remains or belongings. No independent witnesses confirmed the account. Despite this, the narrative continued to influence focus. The lack of alternatives allowed it to persist longer than it should have. Public attention followed the same direction. Media coverage repeated the claims, often without confirmation. As the account circulated, repetition gave it an appearance of legitimacy. Over time, the narrative became familiar, and familiarity was mistaken for truth. Other possibilities existed, but they lacked the same level of apparent detail. Investigators did not ignore them, but the false account occupied a central position. The investigation remained active, yet its movement followed a path built on information that was not reliable. The impact of the misdirection was cumulative. Time spent examining false leads was time not spent elsewhere. Each delay narrowed the window in which certain evidence might have been recoverable. Surveillance footage aged out. Potential witnesses moved away or forgot details. The cost of false information increased with each passing year. Years later, federal court records would confirm what could not be proven at the time. A Georgetown County woman admitted that she had lied to federal investigators during the Brittanee Drexel investigation. The false statements were deliberate. They were not the result of confusion or faulty memory. They were intended to mislead. The legal consequences were significant. She was charged and sentenced for lying to the FBI. The conviction established that the investigation had been obstructed intentionally. This confirmation explained why effort and urgency had failed to produce results for so long. The damage extended beyond lost time. The false narrative shaped public understanding of the disappearance. It influenced how tips were interpreted and which information was prioritized. When a case becomes associated with an untrue explanation, correcting that perception becomes difficult. Law enforcement later acknowledged how deeply the false information affected the investigation. The acknowledgement did not suggest negligence. It reflected how even careful work can be compromised when foundational information is wrong. The persistence of the false narrative also discouraged alternative analysis. When investigators believe a case has a working explanation, even an unproven one, new information is often viewed through that lens. This limits flexibility and reduces the likelihood of questioning core assumptions. As years passed, the case remained unresolved, yet defined in the public mind by a story that was not true. The disappearance was discussed as if its outcome was known, even though no evidence supported that conclusion. This disconnect between belief and proof slowed progress further. Eventually, investigators began re-examining the entire case. That reassessment required stripping away years of assumption and returning to verified facts. Timelines were revisited, statements were reevaluated. The false narrative was treated not as a solution, but as an obstacle. Removing the influence of the deception did not immediately reveal what had happened to Brittanee. What it did was restore clarity. The investigation could once again operate without being anchored to claims that lacked evidence. The misdirection did not define the investigation, but it reshaped it for years. The disappearance remained unresolved not because answers were unreachable, but because the path toward them had been distorted. This period stands as one of the most consequential in the case. It shows how an investigation can move decisively and still move away from the truth when information is false but convincing. It underscores why verification matters more than detail, and why certainty based on deception can be more damaging than uncertainty itself. Only after the false narrative was exposed could the investigation begin to recover its footing. What followed would depend on revisiting what had been overlooked, re-examining evidence without assumption, and allowing facts, rather than fabricated accounts, to guide the search forward. As months passed without resolution, the investigation settled into a quieter rhythm. The early urgency remained, but momentum became harder to sustain. Searches had covered visible ground. Interviews had gathered what witnesses could recall. Tips continued to arrive, though fewer carried new information. What remained was a case active on paper, yet resistant to progress. Law enforcement maintained the investigation, reviewing reports and reassessing earlier steps. Files grew thicker, not because answers were emerging, but because each review added context without clarity. The disappearance did not produce physical evidence that could be tested or traced. Without that anchor, direction depended on information that had already proven unreliable. Public attention shifted gradually. News coverage became less frequent. The absence of updates made it difficult to sustain awareness. This change did not reflect a loss of concern. It reflected the reality that unresolved cases often recede from headlines while remaining open within investigative systems. Brittanee Drexel's family continued to press for answers. They participated in outreach, kept her name visible, and worked with investigators. Their efforts extended beyond South Carolina, reaching audiences in New York and elsewhere. The The family's involvement ensured that the disappearance did not fade completely from public memory. Investigators continued to examine phone records and timelines. Technology available at the time limited precision. Location data showed general areas rather than exact movement. Without corroboration, these details could not establish what happened after Brittanee left the hotel. False leads continued to complicate progress. Some tips repeated earlier claims. Others introduced new possibilities without support. Each had to be evaluated. Most could not be verified. The process required restraint, as pursuing every suggestion risked draining resources without advancing understanding. The case began to resemble many long-term disappearances. It remained open, active, and unresolved. Investigators documented developments carefully, preserving records in anticipation that future information might bring clarity. Preservation became as important as pursuit. Coordination between agencies continued, though no breakthrough emerged. The investigation had crossed state lines, involving authorities from different jurisdictions. Communication remained ongoing, even as new developments failed to materialize. This period exposed how investigations can slow without stopping. Work continued, but it was incremental. Reviews replaced searches. Analysis replaced action. The disappearance did not produce the kind of evidence that forces rapid movement. It required patience instead. Public theories circulated, often disconnected from facts. Law enforcement remained cautious, aware that speculation could distort memory and influence witness statements. The focus stayed on verifiable information, even when that meant acknowledging limitations. The passage of time introduced new challenges. Witness recollections became less precise. Details once recalled confidently became uncertain. This erosion affected what could be reconstructed later. Investigators documented these limitations, recognizing that time changes evidence even when it does not eliminate it. Despite the slowdown, the case was not closed. It remained within active files. Periodic reviews ensured that it did not disappear into storage. Each review asked the same question: whether something had been missed that could now be seen differently. This period did not produce answers, but it shaped what would come later. Records were preserved, assumptions were noted, errors were documented. These actions did not resolve the disappearance, but they kept the investigation intact. The case existed in a state of waiting, not passive, but restrained. The absence of movement did not mean the absence of effort. It meant that the investigation had reached the limits of what was possible without new information. For the family, this period was defined by endurance. For investigators, it was defined by readiness. The disappearance had not been explained, but it had not been forgotten. It remained open to the possibility that time, rather than immediacy, would reveal what early effort could not. The slowing of progress marked a difficult reality. Some cases do not yield answers quickly. They require persistence without reward, attention without outcome, and patience without certainty. Brittanee Drexel's disappearance entered that category, carrying unanswered questions forward into the years that followed. As time continued to pass, the disappearance of Brittanee Drexel settled into a prolonged state of uncertainty. The investigation did not end, but its character changed. Without new evidence or law enforcement agencies retained responsibility across jurisdictions. South Carolina authorities remained in contact with agencies in New York, where Brittanee's family lived. Records were maintained, tips were logged, and periodic reviews were conducted. These actions did not produce visible movement, but they ensured the case did not disappear into inactivity. During this time, the investigation existed largely within files rather than public view. Leads that had once seemed promising were revisited and closed when they could not be supported. Others remained unresolved, not because they were ignored, but because they lacked proof. Investigators worked within those limits, careful not to elevate possibility into conclusion. Public attention diminished as years passed. Media coverage became occasional rather than constant. News stories rarely emerged because there were no developments to report. This shift reflected the reality of long-term missing person cases. When answers do not arrive quickly, attention moves elsewhere, even as families continue waiting. Brittanee's family remained active. They continued to speak publicly, share her image, and ask for information. Their efforts extended beyond one location, keeping the case visible nationally. The family's persistence ensured that Brittanee's name did not vanish from awareness, even when progress was slow. Investigators continued evaluating technological possibilities as they became available. Advances in data analysis and record comparison offered limited assistance. The absence of early physical evidence constrained what newer tools could achieve. Technology cannot replace evidence that was never collected. During these years, speculation grew outside official channels. Online discussions, rumors, and theories circulated, often repeating earlier misinformation. Law enforcement did not engage with these narratives. The focus remained on facts that could be verified and documented. The cold case designation did not mean abandonment. It meant the investigation was waiting. Files were structured so that new information could be assessed quickly if it arrived. This readiness was intentional. Many long-term cases are solved not through continuous action, but through sudden connection years later. The passage of time also brought legal considerations. Witness memories became less reliable. Some individuals involved early on in the investigation moved away or became unreachable. These realities narrowed what could be reconstructed. Investigators documented these constraints carefully. Throughout this period, the disappearance remained unresolved. There was no confirmed suspect, no recovery, and no explanation supported by evidence. The lack of resolution did not reflect lack of effort. It reflected how thoroughly the case had been misdirected earlier and how limited early evidence had been. The case became an example of how investigations can persist without movement. It demonstrated the importance of record-keeping, interagency cooperation, and patience. Even without progress, the groundwork remained in place. For Brittanee's family, the years brought ongoing uncertainty. There was no confirmation of what had happened, only the knowledge that the investigation remained open. This uncertainty defined daily life in ways that did not diminish with time. The cold case years were not marked by dramatic events. They were marked by waiting. Waiting for a tip that could be verified. Waiting for information that could be tested. Waiting for something that had been missed to surface again. This period shaped the eventual outcome in subtle ways. When the case was later reassessed, investigators would rely on preserved records rather than memory. The discipline maintained during these years made that reassessment possible. The disappearance remained unresolved, but not forgotten. The case stayed active in the only way it could, through documentation, readiness, and the understanding that some investigations require time rather than speed. As the years passed, the possibility remained that clarity could still emerge. The case stood positioned for that moment, carrying forward unanswered questions, preserved evidence, and the quiet persistence that defines long-term investigations, waiting for a break. More than a decade after Brittanee Drexel disappeared, the investigation began to move again, not through chance or sudden discovery, but through deliberate reassessment. Time had passed, and with it came distance from earlier assumptions. Investigators approached the case with a clearer understanding of how prior narratives had shaped decisions and how those narratives needed to be stripped away. The renewed effort focused on starting over without erasing history. Every report, interview, and document was reviewed again, not to repeat past work, but to test it. Information once treated as credible was re-examined against what could actually be verified. Claims that lacked support were no longer allowed to guide direction. This shift required acknowledging how deeply false information had influenced earlier efforts. Investigators recognized that years had been spent examining a narrative that did not align with evidence. Removing that influence allowed attention to return to confirmed facts rather than inherited theories. Timelines were rebuilt using documented data. Investigators focused on Brittanee's movements before she disappeared, the locations confirmed by records, and the narrow window during which contact was lost. The goal was clarity, not completeness. What could be proven mattered more than what could be imagined. Advances in analytical methods supported this review. While early technology had limited precision, later tools allowed investigators to reassess phone data and movement patterns with greater context. These tools did not create new evidence, they helped make better sense of what already existed. Attention shifted toward individuals whose presence aligned with verified details. This did not involve speculation or profiling. It involved examining records, travel histories, and known behavior that intersected with confirmed timelines. Investigators were careful to distinguish relevance from coincidence. Interagency cooperation became more focused. South Carolina authorities worked closely with federal agencies and with law enforcement in New York. Information was shared systematically. Comparisons were made across cases and records that had not previously been connected. This coordination reduced isolation and increased perspective. Public tips continued to play a role, but they were evaluated differently. Rather than being weighed against dominant narratives, they were tested against verified facts. Tips that could not be corroborated were documented but not prioritized. This approach reduced distraction and preserved resources. The renewed review also involved recognizing limits. Investigators understood that time had affected memory and availability. Some witnesses could no longer be located. Others could not recall details clearly. These constraints were acknowledged rather than ignored. The investigation worked within them. Gradually, the case began to show movement, not through dramatic revelation, but through alignment. Pieces that had once seemed unrelated began to fit within a coherent framework. The focus narrowed. The investigation moved from broad uncertainty towards specific direction. For Brittanee's family, this period brought cautious attention. Years of waiting had tempered expectations. The renewed activity did not promise resolution, but it suggested that the case was no longer static. Effort was visible again, even if answers were not yet public. The shift demonstrated how time can change investigations in unexpected ways. While time erodes evidence, it can also remove pressure to accept incomplete explanations. Distance allowed investigators to question what had once seemed settled. This renewed focus did not rely on urgency, it relied on discipline. Investigators resisted the need for quick conclusions. They prioritized accuracy over speed, understanding that the cost of error had already been demonstrated. As the review continued, the investigation gained structure. Leads were no longer scattered, they were organized around what could be supported. The disappearance was no longer framed as an unsolvable event shaped by rumor. It was treated as a problem that could still be addressed through careful work. The case moved away from stagnation and toward direction. The renewed review did not erase years of uncertainty. but it redirected effort toward truth rather than assumption. That redirection would soon lead to developments that transformed the case from unresolved disappearance to criminal investigation. The renewed focus marked a quiet but critical change. Without public spectacle or immediate answers, the investigation regained momentum. What followed would depend on the foundation built during this period, a foundation grounded in verified fact, patience, and the willingness to reconsider everything that had come before. With the investigation redirected, attention turned to reconstructing events with precision. The goal was no longer to explain what might have happened, but to establish what could be shown to have happened. Every confirmed detail was placed back onto a timeline, not as narrative, but as structure. Investigators began by narrowing the window of disappearance. Brittanee Drexel was last seen leaving the Bar Harbor Hotel on Ocean Boulevard during the evening hours of April 25th. She carried her phone and left behind items she would normally take if she planned to be gone for long. That fact suggested expectation of return rather than departure. This point mattered because it framed the disappearance as an interruption rather than a decision. Phone data became central again. Earlier analysis had shown activity after Brittanee left the hotel, but limited precision made interpretation difficult. With updated analytical methods, investigators revisited the records to identify patterns rather than exact location. Message timing, signal handoffs, and duration of activity were compared against confirmed geography. The focus was consistency, not pinpoint accuracy. This reassessment clarified what the phone data could and could not show. It confirmed continued activity for a limited period after Brittanee left the hotel. It did not support extended voluntary movement through the area. The phone stopped producing meaningful data within a time frame that aligned with sudden interruption rather than gradual disengagement. Investigators also revisited witness statements tied to that same period. Earlier inconsistencies were examined in context. Rather than seeking a single definitive account, investigators compared overlapping elements across multiple statements. Where independent accounts aligned, those details were given weight. Where they conflicted, they were set aside. Surveillance review was repeated with different priorities. Instead of looking for Brittanee directly, investigators examined vehicle movement, traffic flow, and patterns of activity along Ocean Boulevard and surrounding areas. This approach shifted focus from identifying a person to understanding opportunity. It allowed investigators to see how quickly someone could move through the area without drawing attention. Geography became a key factor. Myrtle Beach during spring break is dense, loud, and crowded. Movement blends easily into background activity. Investigators mapped areas where visibility dropped, lighting changed, or foot traffic thinned. These environmental factors helped explain how an encounter could occur without witnesses recognizing its significance. Attention then shifted to individuals whose documented movements intersected with the timeline. This involved reviewing records unrelated to earlier narratives. Travel logs, employment information, and prior contacts were examined. The purpose was not to confirm suspicion, but to identify alignment between presence and opportunity. Investigators also reviewed prior criminal records within the area during that period. This step was handled carefully. A criminal history alone does not establish relevance. Only records that intersected with verified location and timing were considered. This approach reduced bias and narrowed focus. The reassessment revealed that earlier emphasis on specific narratives had prevented broader comparison. Once those narratives were removed, patterns emerged that had previously gone unnoticed. Certain movements appeared repeatedly across independent data sources. These alignments did not prove responsibility on their own, but they established direction. Interagency cooperation supported this effort. Federal resources allowed cross-comparison of data that local agencies could not easily access years earlier. Information was shared, matched, and reviewed collectively. This collaboration helped ensure that conclusions were not drawn in isolation. The re-examination also included reviewing how earlier tips had been categorized. Some information dismissed previously was reconsidered in light of revised timelines. Other tips once emphasized were downgraded when they failed to align with verified facts. This sorting process was methodical and deliberate. Throughout this work, investigators resisted urgency. They understood the cost of premature conclusion. Each alignment had to be supported by more than coincidence. Where confirmation was not possible, restraint was applied. The timeline gradually became more defined. The disappearance was confined to a narrower window. Movement patterns suggested forced removal rather than voluntary travel. The absence of later confirmed sightings supported this conclusion without requiring speculation. As evidence and timelines aligned, the investigation moved closer to identifying responsibility, not through confession or sudden discovery, but through accumulation. Each confirmed detail reduced uncertainty. Each verified alignment removed alternative explanations. For Brittanee's family, this period remained quiet publicly. Investigative progress did not come with announcements. Work continued behind the scenes. The absence of information did not reflect inaction, it reflected care. The re-examination did not solve the case instantly. What it did was transform it. The disappearance was no longer an event obscured by rumor and false narrative. It became a defined sequence bounded by evidence and time. This clarity allowed investigators to move forward with confidence rather than assumption. The case shifted from review to action, guided by a timeline that now made sense. What followed would depend on the strength of these alignments. The work completed during this period provided the foundation for identifying the person responsible and moving the case into its final phase. The re-examination of evidence and timelines narrowed the field in a way that had not been possible before. What once appeared scattered began to converge around a single set of movements and circumstances. Investigators were no longer working against a broad unknown. They were working toward a specific individual whose presence aligned with verified facts. Attention focused on Raymond Moody, a man living in the Myrtle Beach area at the time Brittanee Drexel disappeared. His name had not dominated early investigation. He had not been part of the false narratives that redirected attention for years. What brought him into focus was not rumor, but alignment. Investigators identified that Moody's location during the period of Brittanee's disappearance placed him within proximity of Ocean Boulevard. Records showed that his movements intersected with the narrow window established through phone data and witness timelines. This overlap did not prove involvement on its own, but it established relevance that could be examined further. Investigators reviewed Moody's background carefully. This review did not rely on assumption. It relied on documented history, known behavior, and records that could be verified. Investigators compared his movements with reconstructed timelines to test whether opportunity existed. The comparison held. The renewed focus also considered the absence of alternative explanations. As earlier narratives were removed, fewer possibilities remained. The investigation did not pivot suddenly. It narrowed through elimination. What could not be supported was set aside. What remained was examined closely. Investigators reviewed prior interactions between Brittanee and anyone connected to the area. There was no evidence that she knew Moody or planned to meet him. This absence mattered. It supported the conclusion that the disappearance was not the result of a prearranged encounter, but of opportunity. The examination of phone data took on new significance. While it could not identify a specific location, it supported the conclusion that Brittanee's movement ended abruptly. The timing of that interruption aligned with the window during which Moody's presence could be confirmed nearby. Law enforcement also evaluated physical geography. Investigators examined routes, access points, and locations where a person could be taken quickly without drawing attention. These assessments were grounded in environment rather than theory. They demonstrated how an encounter could occur without witnesses recognizing its importance. As focus narrowed, investigators exercised restraint. Identifying a suspect required more than alignment. It required confidence that the conclusion could withstand scrutiny. Each step taken was documented. Each inference was tested against evidence. The investigation also benefited from information developed in unrelated cases. Moody had been charged and convicted in other violent crimes. While those crimes could not be used to establish guilt in Brittanee's disappearance, they informed investigators about behavior patterns and risk factors that could be evaluated objectively. Federal involvement increased as the investigation progressed. Coordination between agencies allowed access to broader resources and analytical support. Information was cross-checked, records were matched. The process was deliberate rather than urgent. As evidence converged, investigators prepared for the possibility of action. This preparation did not involve public announcement. It involved internal review, legal consultation, and confirmation that the case had reached a point where accountability could be pursued. The identification of Raymond Moody represented the first time in years that the case had a clear direction, supported by evidence rather than narrative. The disappearance was no longer an abstract mystery. It was linked to a specific individual whose movements, opportunity, and circumstances aligned with verified facts. This moment carried weight because of what preceded it. Years of misdirection had delayed progress. Years of waiting had shaped expectations. The identification did not promise closure, but it restored purpose. Investigators remained aware of the gravity of this step. Accusation without proof would repeat earlier errors. The process that followed would need to be careful, structured, and legally sound. The focus now turned toward action. With a suspect identified, the investigation moved toward arrest and prosecution. That movement would require evidence strong enough to support charges and withstand challenge. The identification did not come from a single piece of information. It emerged from accumulation. Each verified detail removed uncertainty. Each alignment strengthened direction. After more than a decade, the case shifted from unresolved disappearance to active criminal investigation. The identification of Raymond Moody marked the point where years of preservation, reassessment, and restraint finally converged into accountability that could be pursued. What followed would test the strength of that work. The investigation had reached the point where it could no longer remain quiet. The next steps would place the case into the public record once again, this time with purpose grounded in evidence rather than speculation. Once investigators reached a point where evidence aligned consistently, action followed through legal channels. The work that led to this moment had unfolded quietly, built on reassessment rather than urgency. When the case moved forward, it did so with preparation rather than announcement. In May 2022, law enforcement arrested Raymond Moody in connection with the disappearance and murder of Brittanee Drexel. The arrest took place in South Carolina, where Moody had been living. Authorities acted after concluding that the evidence gathered through renewed review and analysis met the threshold required for criminal charges. The arrest marked a decisive shift. For years, the case had existed without a named suspect. Now, responsibility was being pursued formally. Investigators moved carefully, aware that the case would face intense scrutiny due to its age and history. Charges were filed in Georgetown County. Moody was charged with murder, kidnapping, and criminal sexual conduct. These charges reflected conclusions supported by evidence rather than speculation. Each charge carried specific legal standards that prosecutors believed could be met. Law enforcement officials explained that the case against Moody was built through a combination of circumstantial evidence, reconstructed timelines, and information obtained during the renewed investigation. No single discovery produced the arrest. The case relied on accumulation and alignment. Following the arrest, investigators continued working to strengthen the evidentiary record. The filing of charges did not end investigative activity, it shifted its purpose. The focus moved toward preparation for court, ensuring that evidence could be presented clearly and withstand challenge. Moody was held without bond. The seriousness of the charges and the circumstances of the case guided that decision. The court treated the matter with caution, reflecting the gravity of the alleged crimes. Public reaction was immediate. News of the arrest brought Brittanee Drexel's disappearance back into national attention. For many, the development came after years of believing the case might never be resolved. The response was measured rather than celebratory, shaped by the understanding that arrest does not equal conviction. Prosecutors emphasized that the charges were the result of long-term investigative work. They avoided discussing details that could affect proceedings. The focus remained on procedure and the next steps within the legal system. The arrest also prompted renewed examination of related matters. Federal authorities addressed the earlier obstruction that had delayed progress. A Georgetown County woman was charged and sentenced for lying to the FBI during the investigation. That case underscored how misinformation had affected the search for truth. For Brittanee's family, the arrest represented a turning point. Years of uncertainty gave way to formal accountability being pursued. While questions remained, the case had moved decisively into the judicial process. The legal system now assumed responsibility for determining outcome. Investigators transitioned into support roles, assisting prosecutors with documentation, testimony preparation, and evidence review. The emphasis shifted from discovery to presentation. Defense proceedings began alongside prosecution. Moody was entitled to legal representation and due process. The case entered a phase governed by court schedules, filings, and hearings rather than investigative discretion. The arrest did not resolve all aspects of the case. Brittanee's remains had not yet been recovered. Some details remained unknown. What the arrest accomplished was clarity of direction. The case now centered on a specific individual and specific charges. Law enforcement maintained restraint in public statements. They acknowledged the long path that led to this moment, without assigning narrative beyond what evidence supported. This approach reflected lessons learned earlier in the investigation. The arrest represented the culmination of years of preservation, reassessment, and patience. It demonstrated how long dormant cases can move forward when earlier assumptions are challenged and facts are reassembled carefully. As the case advanced through the court system, attention turned toward what could be proven. The focus moved away from how long the case had taken and toward whether the evidence could establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The arrest did not bring closure. It brought accountability into reach. The disappearance that had remained unresolved for more than a decade was now the subject of formal prosecution. The outcome would depend on the strength of the evidence and the application of law. What followed would determine whether years of work would result in conviction. The case had entered its most visible phase, one defined not by investigation, but by judgment within the justice system. After the arrest of Raymond Moody, attention turned to a question that had remained unanswered since 2009. Brittanee Drexel had been missing for more than 13 years, and despite extensive investigation, no physical confirmation of her fate had ever been found. The case had moved into the justice system, but one part of the record was still incomplete. Investigators continued working alongside prosecutors as the case progressed. Information developed during the renewed investigation indicated that Brittanee had not left Myrtle Beach voluntarily, and had not survived beyond the night she disappeared. That conclusion was supported by evidence already gathered, but confirmation required more than inference. It required recovery. Law enforcement focused on locations connected to Moody's documented movements. These areas were not selected at random. They were identified through reconstructed timelines, travel patterns, and environmental assessment. Investigators looked for places that were accessible, isolated, and consistent with opportunity during the narrow window of Brittanee's disappearance. In May 2022, authorities announced that human remains had been located in a wooded area near Georgetown, South Carolina. The location was several miles from Myrtle Beach, away from populated areas and common travel routes. The site reflected how a person could be taken quickly from a public area to a place unlikely to draw attention. The recovery was handled with care. Investigators secured the area and worked methodically. Forensic specialists documented the site and collected remains for examination. The goal was confirmation, not reconstruction. Responsibility had already been charged. The recovery was meant to complete the factual record. Forensic testing confirmed that the remains belonged to Brittanee Drexel. Identification was made through scientific analysis rather than assumption. The confirmation aligned with evidence already established through the investigation and criminal charges. The discovery did not change the legal direction of the case. Charges had already been filed. The arrest had already occurred. What the recovery provided was certainty. It resolved the physical uncertainty that had defined the disappearance for more than a decade. Authorities emphasized that the location of the remains was consistent with investigative findings. The recovery supported the conclusion that Brittanee had been taken from Myrtle Beach shortly after leaving her hotel. It reinforced the timeline developed through phone data and witness analysis. For Brittanee's family, the recovery marked a profound moment. Years of waiting without confirmation ended with answers that were painful but definitive. The uncertainty that had followed them since 2009 was replaced with truth, even though that truth carried loss. The announcement was handled with restraint. Law enforcement avoided unnecessary detail. The focus remained on confirmation and respect. The recovery was not presented as a conclusion to the case, but as a necessary step toward completion. The discovery also underscored how time can separate legal accountability from physical answers. In this case, charges and arrest came before recovery. The justice system had moved forward based on evidence strong enough to establish responsibility. The recovery confirmed what had already been alleged, rather than introducing new accusations. Investigators continued documenting the recovery process to ensure the record was complete. The site, the examination, and the identification were all entered into official files. This documentation ensured that the case now contained both legal and physical confirmation. Public response was subdued. After years of speculation and false narratives, the confirmation was received with seriousness rather than shock. The recovery closed a chapter that had remained open since the day Brittanee disappeared. The location of the remains also provided insight into how the disappearance had remained unsolved for so long. The area was remote. Without information pointing investigators there, discovery would have been unlikely. This reality highlighted the importance of the renewed review that had redirected the investigation. The recovery did not attempt to answer every question. It did not explain every action or detail. It answered the central one. Brittanee Drexel had been killed, and her remains had been located. With confirmation established, the case moved closer to resolution. The recovery allowed the investigation to stand complete in its factual scope. Disappearance, investigation, identification of a suspect, arrest, and recovery now formed a continuous record. The justice system continued its course, but the nature of the case changed. It was no longer defined by absence. It was defined by confirmation and accountability. The recovery also served as a reminder of how fragile early opportunity can be. Without physical evidence, investigations rely heavily on information. When that information is false or incomplete, answers can be delayed for years. For investigators, the recovery represented the culmination of long effort. For the family, it marked the end of uncertainty. For the case itself, it completed the timeline that began in April 2009. The disappearance that once ended in silence now ended in confirmation. While the recovery did not bring comfort, it brought truth. That truth allowed the case to move forward without unanswered factual questions remaining. With the remains identified and documented, the focus returned fully to the courtroom. The investigation had done what it could. The responsibility now rested with the legal process to determine consequence for the crime that had been hidden for so long. With Brittanee Drexel's remains recovered and responsibility formally pursued, the case moved fully into the courtroom. The focus shifted from investigation to judgment. Years of reconstruction, reassessment, and preparation were now tested within a legal setting, governed by rules of evidence and procedure rather than investigative discretion. Prosecutors presented a case built on alignment rather than spectacle. The disappearance, the narrowed timeline, the environmental analysis, and the identification of Raymond Moody were placed before the court as a coherent sequence supported by records. The approach reflected the age of the case. Claims were limited to what could be demonstrated. Assertions were tied directly to documentation. The prosecution outlined how Brittanee left her hotel during spring break, carrying only her phone and expecting to return. Evidence showed that her movement stopped abruptly within a narrow window. Investigators presented the reconstructed timeline developed during the renewed review, showing how her disappearance aligned with Moody's presence and opportunity in the area. Phone data was addressed carefully. Prosecutors explained what the records could show and what they could not. The information supported a sudden interruption of activity rather than prolonged voluntary movement. The presentation avoided speculation and remained grounded in technical explanation. Environmental evidence was used to explain opportunity. The court heard how the setting along Ocean Boulevard allowed movement to blend into background activity, and how access points could lead quickly to less visible areas. This analysis did not claim certainty about every step. It demonstrated plausibility supported by geography. Investigators testified about the reassessment that led to identifying Moody as a suspect. The testimony focused on process rather than outcome. The court was shown how earlier narratives were removed and how evidence was evaluated independently. This explanation addressed the history of misdirection without assigning blame for past delays. The prosecution also presented evidence related to Moody's background and documented behavior. This information was introduced within legal limits, providing context without substituting character for proof. The court was asked to consider alignment between opportunity, presence, and the disappearance, rather than isolated facts. Defense arguments challenged the strength of circumstantial evidence and the passage of time. The defense emphasized the absence of early physical evidence and the years between the disappearance and arrest. These challenges reflected the reality of long-term cases and were addressed within the framework of law. The court evaluated whether the evidence presented met the standard required for conviction. The focus remained on whether the prosecution had established guilt beyond reasonable doubt, based on admissible evidence and reliable testimony. Throughout the proceedings, the tone remained restrained. There were no dramatic revelations. The case did not rely on confession or eyewitness identification. It relied on accumulation and consistency. The jury considered the evidence within this structure. Deliberation reflected the seriousness of the charge and the weight of the decision. The outcome did not hinge on emotion or narrative. It hinged on whether the presented facts formed a convincing and lawful conclusion. The verdict found Raymond Moody guilty of murdering Brittanee Drexel. The conviction established legal responsibility for a crime that had remained unresolved for more than a decade. The decision reflected acceptance of the prosecution's presentation and rejection of alternative explanations unsupported by evidence. The conviction marked a critical point in the case. For years, Brittanee's disappearance had been defined by uncertainty and false narratives. The verdict replaced that uncertainty with judicial determination. Responsibility was no longer an investigative conclusion, it was a legal finding. The court's decision acknowledged the limitations imposed by time, without allowing those limitations to outweigh evidence. The age of the case did not prevent accountability, it shaped how accountability was pursued. For Brittanee's family, the conviction provided formal recognition of responsibility. The courtroom outcome did not erase loss or restore what had been taken. It placed truth into the record through lawful process. Public response to the verdict was measured. The case had followed a long and complex path. The conviction was received with seriousness rather than reaction. It represented resolution within the justice system rather than an end to impact. The trial demonstrated how cases affected by misdirection and delay can still reach conclusion when evidence is reassessed carefully. It showed the importance of restraint, documentation, and willingness to revisit assumptions. With the verdict delivered, the case moved towards sentencing. The legal system had completed the determination of guilt. The next step would address consequences, guided by statute and judicial review rather than investigation. The conviction closed one of the most significant chapters in the case. Brittanee Drexel's disappearance was no longer an unsolved event. It was a crime with responsibility established through trial. The proceedings underscored a central reality of long-term investigations. Truth does not always arrive quickly. It arrives through persistence and adherence to process. The courtroom outcome reflected that principle. With guilt established, the case entered its final legal phase. What remained was to determine how accountability would be expressed through sentence and how the broader record would reflect the outcome reached after years of effort. After the guilty verdict, the case moved into a stage defined by consequence rather than determination. Responsibility had been established through trial. The remaining question was how that responsibility would be expressed under the law. The courtroom focus shifted from evidence to judgment, guided by statute and judicial discretion rather than investigative analysis. Sentencing proceedings centered on the severity of the crime and the circumstances proven in court. Brittanee Drexel had been 17 years old when she disappeared. She had been taken from a public place during spring break and killed. The court considered the nature of the offense, the impact on the victim and her family, and the absence of mitigating factors that could lessen responsibility. Prosecutors sought a sentence that reflected the seriousness of the crime and the length of time Brittanee had been missing before accountability was reached. They emphasized that the delay in resolution was not the result of inaction, but of obstruction and misdirection that had concealed the truth for years. The sentence, they argued, needed to recognize both the harm done and the persistence required to uncover it. The defense addressed sentencing within the boundaries allowed by law. Arguments focused on legal standards rather than reinterpretation of facts already decided by the jury. The court weighed these submissions against statutory requirements and the jury's verdict. The judge imposed a life imprisonment. The sentence reflected the gravity of the offense and the absence of any legal basis for leniency. With that decision, the court formalized accountability in the most direct way available under the law. The sentencing marked the end of the criminal trial process. Appeals remained possible, but the trial court's role in determining consequence was complete. the case had moved from disappearance to conviction and now to punishment through lawful procedure. Alongside the murder case, the justice system addressed another aspect that had shaped the investigation for years. The obstruction caused by false information had delayed progress and redirected effort. That obstruction was not left unresolved. A Georgetown County woman who had lied to federal investigators during the Brittanee Drexel investigation faced separate legal consequences. Federal prosecutors charged her with making false statements to the FBI. Court records showed that her actions had contributed directly to misdirection during the early years of the case. She was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The sentence reflected the seriousness of obstructing a missing person investigation and the long-term impact of her actions. The federal case underscored that accountability extended beyond the person who committed the murder. It also applied to those who interfered with the search for truth. The federal conviction clarified why the investigation had struggled for so long. It confirmed that misinformation had not merely complicated the case, it had actively delayed resolution. This acknowledgement did not change the outcome of the murder trial, but it provided explanation for the years of uncertainty. Together, the sentences represented a comprehensive legal response. The person responsible for Brittanee's death was held accountable through life imprisonment. The person who obstructed the investigation was held accountable through federal sentencing. Each outcome addressed a different harm, but both were rooted in the same disappearance. For Brittanee's family, sentencing brought a form of finality within the justice system. The years of waiting, searching, and uncertainty ended with clear legal outcomes. The court decisions did not restore what had been lost, but they placed responsibility firmly on the record. Public response to sentencing was restrained. The case had unfolded over more than a decade. By the time judgment was delivered, the focus was not on reaction, but on acknowledgement. The legal system had done what it could within its limits. The sentencing also reinforced broader lessons about long-term investigations. Obstruction can delay justice, but it does not erase it. Persistence, record preservation, and reassessment can still lead to accountability even after many years. The court's decisions closed the criminal chapter of the case. Responsibility was established. Consequence was imposed. What remained was the civil process and the longer view of impact beyond the courtroom. The sentencing stage demonstrated how justice can be delayed without being denied. The disappearance that once ended in silence ended with judgment grounded in law. The outcomes reflected seriousness rather than symbolism, and procedure rather than emotion. With sentences imposed, the case moved into its final considerations. The criminal justice system had completed its role. The remaining questions would involve accountability beyond criminal court and the lasting impact of a case that had shaped a community and a family for more than a decade. After criminal sentencing established responsibility and consequence, the case continued within a different legal forum. The criminal court had addressed guilt and punishment. Civil court addressed harm, liability, and accountability beyond incarceration. This process did not revisit criminal findings, it relied on them. Brittanee Drexel's family pursued civil action connected to her abduction and murder. Civil litigation serves a different purpose from criminal prosecution. It does not determine guilt beyond reasonable doubt. It evaluates responsibility through a lower legal threshold and focuses on damages resulting from wrongful conduct. The civil case centered on Raymond Moody and the actions that led to Brittanee's death. The factual record developed through the criminal investigation and trial formed the foundation. Evidence already accepted by the court was introduced again, not to prove the crime, but to establish liability. Civil proceedings examined the impact of Brittanee's disappearance and death on her family. The court considered loss, harm, and the long period of uncertainty that followed her disappearance. This evaluation did not involve speculation. It relied on documented consequences and established legal standards. The civil process also addressed accountability in a broader sense. While criminal sentencing removed liberty, civil judgment addressed responsibility for harm. These outcomes serve different functions, but together they form a more complete legal response. The court reviewed the timeline from Brittanee's disappearance in 2009 through recovery of her remains and conviction. The years of delay caused by misdirection and obstruction were part of that record. The civil case did not seek to explain why the delay occurred. It focused on what harm resulted. A jury ultimately found in favor of Brittanee's family. The verdict included a substantial damages award. The amount reflected the seriousness of the harm and the circumstances established in court. The award did not carry symbolic language. It followed legal calculation rather than emotion. The damages award was not presented as compensation in any meaningful sense. Courts cannot restore what was lost. Civil judgments acknowledge harm and assign responsibility under law. That function remains central to the proceeding. The civil verdict reinforced the criminal findings. It confirmed that responsibility extended beyond punishment and into legal accountability for consequences suffered by others. The judgment added another layer of closure within the justice system. Public response to the civil outcome was restrained. The case had already reached criminal resolution. The civil verdict did not change responsibility. It expanded acknowledgement of harm. The civil process also highlighted the length of time the family lived without answers. While criminal court addressed the act itself, civil court recognized the extended impact of years spent searching and waiting. This recognition did not require narrative embellishment. It rested on fact. The civil litigation marked one of the final legal actions connected to Brittanee Drexel's disappearance. With both criminal and civil judgments entered, the justice system had addressed the case through all available avenues. The outcome demonstrated how accountability can extend beyond incarceration. Criminal court establishes guilt. Civil court establishes responsibility for harm. Together, they form a comprehensive legal response. For Brittanee's family, the civil verdict represented acknowledgement rather than resolution. It placed the impact of the crime into the legal record. It did not alter loss, but it recognized it formally. The civil judgment also reinforced lessons from the case. Harm caused by violent crime does not end with conviction. Its effects extend across years, families, and communities. Civil court exists to address that extended impact. With the civil process complete, the case reached its final legal chapter. Criminal punishment had been imposed. Civil accountability had been recognized. No further legal determination remained. What followed was not litigation, but reflection on how the case moved through every level of the justice system. The disappearance that began without explanation ended with responsibility assigned through multiple legal paths. The civil verdict closed the last courtroom door connected to Brittanee Drexel's case. What remained was the lasting record of accountability established through law, rather than through assumption or speculation. The case now exists as a complete public record, defined not by rumor or speculation, but by verified events and legal outcomes. What began with the disappearance of a teenager during a crowded spring break week ended years later with accountability established through investigation, trial, sentencing, and civil judgment. The length of that journey shaped every part of its outcome. The record shows how quickly a case can become difficult when early evidence is limited. Brittanee Drexel vanished from a public area filled with people, noise, and movement. That environment allowed an encounter to occur without leaving immediate trace. Early uncertainty was not the result of delay or indifference. It was the result of conditions that concealed what happened. The investigation also demonstrates how vulnerable cases can be to false information. Misdirection altered priorities, delayed progress, and shaped public understanding for years. The later exposure of that obstruction explained why persistence alone was not enough. Accuracy mattered more than urgency, and verification mattered more than detail. Over time, preservation became critical. Records were maintained, tips were logged, assumptions were documented rather than erased. This discipline allowed investigators to return years later and reassess the case without starting from nothing. Long-term investigations depend on this kind of continuity. The renewed review that followed showed how distance can improve clarity. Removed from early pressure and false narratives, investigators were able to see patterns that had previously been obscured. The case did not change because time passed. It changed because perspective did. Legal proceedings reflected that same restraint. Prosecutors limited claims to what could be supported. Courts applied standards carefully. The outcome did not rely on confession or dramatic discovery. It relied on accumulation and consistency. This approach allowed accountability to be established even after many years. The recovery of Brittanee's remains confirmed what the investigation had already concluded. It completed the factual record rather than altering it. The sequence of events mattered. Legal accountability came before physical confirmation, demonstrating that justice can move forward when evidence supports it, even if every answer is not yet known. Sentencing and civil judgment addressed different forms of responsibility. Criminal court imposed consequence for the act itself. Civil court acknowledged harm and loss suffered over years of uncertainty. Together, these outcomes formed a comprehensive response within the justice system. The impact of the case extended beyond courtrooms. Brittanee's disappearance affected her family, her community, and public trust. The years without answers shaped lives in ways that cannot be measured by verdicts. The eventual resolution did not erase that impact, but it placed it into context. The record also offers clear lessons. Early verification is essential. False information can cause lasting harm. Preservation of evidence and records allows future reassessment. Coordination across agencies matters, especially when cases cross jurisdictions. Time alone does not solve cases. Careful work does. The case illustrates how accountability can arrive late without being lost. Justice was delayed, but it was not abandoned. The process required patience, correction, and willingness to revisit assumptions that had gone unchallenged for too long. For those who followed the case over the years, the resolution replaced uncertainty with clarity. The disappearance was no longer defined by competing explanations. It was defined by fact, responsibility, and legal determination. The story does not end with comfort or closure. Criminal cases rarely do. It ends with record, a clear sequence of events established through evidence, a person held responsible through law, consequences imposed through proper process. What remains is the understanding that some cases demand time and persistence beyond expectation. The disappearance of Brittanee Drexel stands as an example of how investigations can falter, recover, and ultimately reach truth when guided by discipline rather than assumption. The final measure of the case lies not in how long it took, but in how it concluded. Through reassessment, verification, and legal process, unanswered questions were replaced with accountability. That outcome did not come easily, but it came honestly. The record now stands complete, not as a narrative shaped by speculation, but as a documented account of loss, investigation, and responsibility. It serves as a reminder of what is required when justice must be pursued across time.